spiel. This meeting of the Noank Zoning Commission will take place to resume remote meeting technology. My name is Rick Smith. I'm chairman of the commission. The host of the meeting is Larry Dunn, alternate zoning commission member. Participants in this meeting will be the commission members, elected alternates, staff, and the commission's counsel if he joins. Anyone should state their names prior to speaking each time they speak. Participants who would like to comment on an item or share a screen item should indicate such by using the raised hand icon at the bottom of the screen or by raising your hand in front of the screen. After the raised hand has been detected, the participant will have the opportunity to speak after being called upon by the chairman. Participants should mute their microphones until called upon. Procedurally, to offer a motion or second a motion, commissioners should physically raise their hand and be acknowledged by the chairman. To vote on a motion, commissioners will be called upon individually by the chair. Members of the public who have logged on or called in will be observing the meeting, but there will be no public comment since this is a special meeting, business meeting. All participants must identify themselves before speaking each time they speak. Members of the public can submit comments by writing to the commission after the meeting for consideration on any item discussed. Finally, a recording of tonight's meeting will be posted on the Town of Groton's website within 7 days of the meeting. Okay, now I will read the roll. It's easier for me and probably for you. I've identified myself. Dana Oviatt is a member. Beth Steele is a member. Nip Tanner is a member. Blake Powell is a member. Larry Dunn and Lynn Marshall are alternates. And Jen Johnson is staff. So I'm still adding people in as they join. Okay, the sole purpose of the meeting tonight is to hear 3 individual commissioners' plan views on how they would manage the short-term rental issue. And without further ado, I'm going to ask Dana if you would do yours first.
Okay, that should be the first slide. Okay, good. So this shouldn't take more than about 10 minutes. So if you're stressed for time, I'm your man. I want to describe the limited permits idea and then compare it to some of the other proposals that have been submitted by other commissioners. Here's the crux of the idea. A fixed number of permits would be issued. Permits would remain the property of the fire district. If the house were sold, the permit would be returned to the fire district. That permit would go to the next person on a waiting list. Exceptions to this rule would be permitted if the property were sold to a member of the immediate family, that is, wife, husband, children, or siblings. As of 2019, there were about 25 short-term operators in Noank. A total of 30 permits would be an appropriate number based upon the present demand to operate short-term rentals. This number would then be kept at a constant level. However, initially up to 40 permits would be made available. This higher number would allow for properties we may not have counted and for homeowners who have immediate plans to run a short-term rental. Over time, it is anticipated that some owners will give back their permits to the district. For example, many operators may decide that operating a short-term rental is not worth the annual fee or is simply too arduous an endeavor. Once the number of permits dwindled to 29, the first person on the waiting list would be given the 30th permit. The number of permits would remain at 30 forever after. There would be an initial deadline of 3 months to apply for a permit. Those applying for a permit after this deadline would be put on the waiting list. There would be no limit and no restrictions on the number of times an operator could rent. The philosophy behind the limited permits idea is that rental activity should be controlled up front in the beginning by limiting the number of operators rather than restricting the number of times that an owner can rent. This has significant advantages for monitoring and enforcement, which I'll talk about later. You are simply monitoring 30 operators rather than monitoring a lot of complicated rental restrictions. There would be no restrictions placed on whether the owner is a legal resident or not, nor would there be any restrictions placed on the amount of time that an owner spends in Noank, that is, if they were full-time or part-time. Likewise, the same permit would be required for whole houses, apartments, and bedrooms. Finally, the same permit would be required regardless of whether the operator
This guy's actually, the next door neighbor had a good idea.
I can hear you. Please mute yourself. Finally, the same permit would be required regardless of whether the owner was on-site or off-site during the rental. There would be a limit of 1 permit per homeowner. In a situation where both an entire house and annex were available, rental of only 1 would be allowed. The annual cost for a permit would be $250. The minimum age of the renter would be 25. Signage would be prohibited. There would be a 4-year, in order to discourage individuals from buying a home simply to run a short-term rental, there would be a 4-year moratorium. That is, the property must have been owned by the same person for 4 years before being granted a permit. The limited permit idea does not address parking issues simply because there is no way to monitor or enforce parking in Noank in the first place. There are no meter maids. No one is going to go around giving tickets. No neighbor is going to be able to tell if the parked cars are part of a short-term rental, parked for the town dock, for Carson's, for Ford's, or for someone visiting a neighbor. How do you handle noise and unruly behavior? Obviously, you need some rules. These rules would be no loud music after 10. Parties and events would be prohibited. These rules would be incorporated into the contracts between the short-term rental company, the owner, and the renter. In addition, it would be mandatory that neighbors be notified by the owner that they were operating a short-term rental before being issued a permit. How do you monitor and enforce these rules for noise? All the other proposals have been silent on this point. None of these rules regarding noise can be enforced without a complaint from somebody. Enforcement will never occur unless there's a complaint to the zoning control officer. The ZEO would investigate, and that complaint would go into the owner-operator's record for consideration when they renew the permit the next year. So now I'd like to, for clarity, compare my proposal, I shouldn't say my proposal, limited term proposal, to some of the other ideas that have been proposed in 4 areas: parking, who gets to rent, frequency of rental, and monitoring and enforcement. So first of all, parking. Most of the other proposals suggest that all parking should be off-street, but it is unclear what would happen if the owner doesn't have a driveway, except perhaps to say that there would be exceptions for absence of availability and non-conforming lots. Limited permits does not address parking regulations because parking is impossible to monitor and enforce. Who gets to rent? 2 of the proposals would restrict operators from renting depending upon several factors: the owner's legal residency, whether the owner is living part-time or full-time in Noank, whether the owner is on site during the rental, and whether the rental property is an apartment, room, or whole house. The other 5 proposals allow everybody to rent, but they do limit the number of times that an owner can rent. Limited permits would not restrict anybody from getting a permit based upon these criteria. It would give everyone an opportunity to apply for a permit, but would hold the number of operators at a fixed number. Most of the other proposals have limits on the number of times operators are allowed to rent. The range of days per year that owners are allowed to rent ranges across the various proposals from 45 nights to 100 nights per year. Another proposal suggests 2 rentals every 4 weeks during the summer and 2 rentals per week during the winter. The limited permit idea controls rental activity up front by limiting the number of operators at its present level and allows these operators to rent their properties as much as they want. Monitoring enforcement. Most of the other proposals dictate penalties for breaking the rules. Here are two examples. One states that there would be fines for violation of $250 to $750 per day. Another proposal states that there would be a $1,000 fine for operating without a permit. But you can't enforce anything unless you accurately monitor. For example, if the regulation dictates a limit of 50 rentals per year, how are we to know that an owner has rented more than this? None of the other proposals state exactly how they're going to monitor. 3 proposals suggest that enforcement should be monitored by any means practical, including using an internet-based monitoring system, which I assume is a company like Host Compliance. Although these proposals state that the cost of such an internet monitoring company would be borne by the operators, the proposals give no estimate of what such a contract might cost. Furthermore, although an internet-based company may monitor short-term rental activity, they would be unable to carry out the actual enforcement, such as imposing fines and taking away permits. Will such enforcement and the interface between the internet company and the zoning enforcement officer necessitate additional hours from the zoning enforcement officer? One proposal states that all enforcement must be done with, quote, minimal additional staff hours, but there apparently has been no indication about whether this might be needed. So the limited permits idea is trying to make monitoring enforcement as simple as possible so the district doesn't have to bear increased costs of hiring an outside contractor or hiring additional staff to communicate with the internet company and enforce short-term regulation. So in a nutshell, the limited permit idea is simple. The other proposals are relatively more complex. And I don't know how long that is, but that's it for me.
All right, thank you, Dana. Yeah, I think you got under your time limit, so that's pretty good. Questions now, and I urge you to not debate points, phrase it as a question. Would your proposal do this, or could you clarify that? We're going to end up with time at future meetings to debate all of these once we've heard all the proposals. So having said that, who has a question first for Dana? Larry.
Yeah, Larry Dunn, thanks. Dana, is there any legal precedence or feedback on the challenges that might be made to limiting the number of permits? I think Dana just froze.
Yeah, he did, as a matter of fact. He's
Yeah.
not.
We had a blip in the electricity.
Yeah, mine flickered a little too.
And he dropped off.
He dropped out. He's probably gone out and coming back in. So let's wait a minute.
That may be a precursor to all of us losing our electricity.
Yeah.
Can we mute everybody except speakers?
I just did. So everyone is now muted. So we've got to unmute. Or Rick, you can unmute people. Well, how long do we give Dana?
I'd give him another minute.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit of a problem. If not, we can just hear Lynn's presentation and save your questions and maybe do them both at the end.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate, because I know he put a lot of time into preparing this. So I'm inclined to want to give him a minute more to maybe get back on.
I see the town council canceled their meeting for tonight because they were concerned about possible power outages.
Yeah. I'm gonna email him and see if he can get back on.
I can look down my neighbor's driveway and see if a tree fell on his house.
Okay, a tree fell down right across the street from me. Fortunately, it wasn't a really big one. It was just 20 feet tall.
That's good planning.
Well, I emailed him and I see no reply yet. That's unfortunate.
Yeah, let me call him, see what I get.
All right.
No, we did not. Did you? Okay. All right, I'll let everybody know. Thanks. Yeah, he lost power. He said he's about to sign on again.
Okay.
We just had a blip. Apparently his was more.
Mine flickered too. Yeah. Okay, here he comes.
There he is.
He's back on. Okay. All right. Okay, Dana. No, wait a minute. I keep hitting unmute and
Oh, I was doing the same thing.
okay,
Hands
so
off.
get it right.
He's showing us his house.
Yeah. We can hear us. I can't get
Can't hear.
control of it, Larry. Maybe you should do it and I'll stay out of it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be unmuting for some reason. There it goes.
Okay.
Whoop.
Yeah, it was at my end. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm sorry. I lost power for like a half a second, then everything went down.
Understood. Okay, so we were at questions and Larry had the first one.
Dana, my question was, is there any legal precedence, restrictions, or input from the attorneys on the challenges that might occur as a result of having a fixed number of permits?
I'm not aware of any. I haven't researched it because there hasn't been an awful lot of interest so far. All that I'm aware of, and I think Lynn can give you more information on this, is that there are other towns that have initiated a limited permits idea.
Okay, someone else? Nip and then Lynn.
I've got two questions. Given that there will be a 30-day window for people to sign up for one of the limited number of initial permits, what protection, if any, is there from somebody saying, oh, I may want to do that someday. I'm not sure I want to do it now, but I'll invest the $250 to give myself that potential without an intention of actively using it.
There would be no prohibition against it.
Okay. In terms of the moratorium, how does that apply to the existing operators?
I think, yeah, I think we discussed this a couple of weeks ago. I think that it would have, it's not something I've actually thought about. My first inkling was that it won't have any effect on them.
Okay.
What were you thinking?
My impression is there is one existing operator which where the primary purpose appears to have been to operate a short-term rental, and it's less than 4 years old, but they would be allowed to continue?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer for that right now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Lynn.
And you. Okay. Yeah, I have some questions. In your written plan, Dana, you had talked about those 40 initial permits being distributed, half of them, 20 of them, being in the village residential, waterfront commercial, and village commercial district, and the other 20 being outside the village in those residential districts. Is that still what your plan is? Have you kept to that?
The plan was originally devised kind of on a napkin, and that's what came up. I don't think that there was necessarily any rationale for that, except that the distribution made sense. There's room to wiggle in there if another proposal makes sense.
Well, I think that 30% of the houses are in the residential, the village residential, waterfront commercial, and village commercial, and about approximately 70% outside. So when you do the 20 and the 20, that means that the percentage of the houses, there would be 9% in the village where the houses are close together and more crowded, and 4% allowed outside the village. So I would think you might want to do some rethinking of that. Particularly since the Noank zoning regulations say that one of the goals is to lessen congestion in the streets and avoid undue concentration of the population. So under that one, I think that you might want to, under that goal, you might want to consider it. One thing I wondered if you have thought about when you say 1 permit per homeowner, and what the situation I'm going to describe to you actually has occurred in other places. So it could actually allow quite a bit of commercial activity. So a businessman could he owns a house in Noank, and he buys a house and he uses it as a short-term rental. That's his one. Then another house is bought and put in the name of his spouse. Third house is put in the name of one child. A fourth house is put in the name of another child. And so under your plan, then the homeowner with the spouse and the 2 children can purchase and operate 4 commercial short-term rental properties, and with more children, more houses. So under your plan, is that what you intended? To allow that?
That wouldn't be my intention. I'm not sure how you would get around that. I'm not sure how you would regulate that offhand.
Yeah, you can. We could talk of. Yeah,
Okay.
that's doable. I was wondering, how did you calculate the costs at $200 a year? That seems low because even I agree that your plan requires a lot less monitoring activity than some of the other plans. But do you plan to monitor for illegal activity? That is, people operating without licenses. That requires the contracting company. You have to have costs for that. If there's illegal activity occurring, you've got to budget for extra staff time if you don't want to allow that activity to continue. How are the people going to complete their license applications? They're going to do those online. If extra staff help is needed for maybe there are about 10% of the people who have trouble doing it online, that they would need help with that. The extensive noise in the party houses, there's extra time spent, those complaints need to be logged in some fashion. ZEO time, there's extra hours for that. There are costs for the short-term rental operators who don't follow the minimal rules that you do have. So do you think that your thought that those costs would cover all of those monitoring and enforcement activities?
Yeah. So the original impetus for the idea was to be as simple as possible so that we didn't have to hire a contractor like Host Compliance, and so that we didn't have to hire extra staff in order to have the interface between Host Compliance and the ZEO, and so that the ZEO wouldn't have to hire additional staff to do all that. And that's why I'm suggesting that the major monitoring is in the frequency of rental. So if you leave the frequency of rental open and the number of operators closed, that is regulated highly, then you're going to need less monitoring. Now, if it does indeed if we find out in advance that monitoring is going to be needed by Host Compliance, I have no reason not to increase the fee. But part of my worry is that we haven't done any of the research on exactly how much it's going to be to hire a company like Host Compliance, and what the interface is between Host Compliance and the ZEO will be. Is it going to be complicated? Is it going to be simple? How does Host Compliance pass off the ball to zoning enforcement in order to have this thing go?
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Yeah.
Where the intent was to get clarification from Dana's presentation. I mean, I've got responses that we have done research, for example, on the cost of compliance, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't think it was pertinent to get into that discussion now, other than to get his input is he doesn't have the data. And that's the extent of his input.
I mean, I was waiting for Lynn to not frame her comments as a question, but then she did at the end. And I think we ought to take Dana's answer as it stands, but reserve debate on everything until a later time. You got to take good notes and remember what you wanted to talk about. That's the downside of doing it this way. The upside is everybody gets a fair chance to present their proposal and have questions asked, but not comments. So
right. So it is one of the goals. So that was the reason for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm.
And then a final question, I will phrase this in terms of the goal. How do you address goal D, preventing properties from frequently turning over?
Okay, so give me an example of when it's most likely that a property would frequently turn over.
in the summer when the rentals are the most in demand, and sometimes people are leaving on one day and coming the next day, and there's just a constant booking of that property.
I guess in the spirit of the limited permits idea, the shorter answer is that I wouldn't. I guess I wouldn't.
Okay. Blake or Beth? Questions? Nothing for Blake, nothing for Beth. Okay, I have a few. Dana, it's very similar to what Lynn asked, but I'm going to phrase it a little bit differently. Your proposal says that people get limited permits, but they can rent as much as they want. And that creates what I call a churn. And what I'd like to know is, have you considered what that does to the neighbors around those few houses who have a permit? It just, in a logic development, have you given that some thought?
So are you talking about clustering, the issue of clustering, or?
I'm talking about one house with one of these scarce permits, and the neighbors all around that house have constant turnover, which I just defined as churn, but basically, every few days another group comes in, maybe 2 rentals a week, maybe 1 rental a week. And I don't want to debate the point. I want to ask you if you've considered the implications of, because I think what you had said was your proposal is limit the number of permits, but let those few permit holders do as much renting as they want. Have you considered the implications for the neighbors of that property?
So can I ask you another question?
Sure.
What do you define as churn? What would the definition?
The same thing Lynn did, which is simply frequent turnover, which is one of the goals we had in the purpose document.
Right, but what I'm saying is, what's the definition? What's the operational definition of frequent turnover?
We didn't define it. We talked about it as being every weekend a new group of people comes in. And theoretically, you could even have 2 per week for 3 days each if you really were ambitious and your property was in high demand. Before we go defining how many rentals per week is too many, I just want to know if you've considered that point in.
Okay, so yeah, the answer is I have not considered that point. Depending upon the definition of churn, I think maybe the limited permits idea should consider some limitation to at least reduce it.
Okay, related to that, and again, as a question, in the discussions we've had over the last few meetings, we had the 1 rental per 2 weeks and the 1 rental per month concepts. Had you thought about it in that context? I'm trying desperately to not debate. I just want to see if you've thought about what happens when there's too many rentals per property per period of time, and what do you do about that then?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I haven't thought about that because I haven't heard complaints about churn, and I don't, again, I hate to go back to the operational definition of churn, but I guess the operational definition of churn depends upon person living next door, whether they're going to complain or not.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Let me the next one then. Did you consider when you assign very few permits, and they're, I would call them hot commodities for lack of a better definition, have you considered what you say to all the other people who didn't get one?
Well, when didn't they get one? Give me
Well,
the
if they apply and there's only 15 allowed or 20 allowed per zone, village versus elsewhere, what do you do when 40 of them actually apply for it because it's a hot commodity? You can make a lot of money with these things, and this very discussion may prompt people to say, hey, I hadn't thought about it, but I think I'll do that because I can make some money. Once you limit the permit, it's going to take on more interest among more people. And your proposal seems to be premised on, well, we think there's about 8 to 15 depending on area. So we'll issue maybe 10 to 20. And that means everybody doing it now will get a permit. And that's the big presumption. And then the other ones go on a waiting list. Well, what if you have your 3-month application period and 50 people in the village all apply and they want to get a permit? Have you thought about what kind of a process you need to allocate those permits? And what do you say to the person who's been doing short-term rental forever, but they don't win the lottery?
Yep. No, I understand. And I guess the answer to that, in keeping with the limited permits idea, is that if, you know, originally the idea is you throw open to 40 and you reduce it to 50 to 30. If 42 or 43 apply, then you give it to them. You don't worry about it. You just give it to them and you wait for the permits to dwindle. I mean, your supposition, your assumption is that once these become quote unquote limited, that they're going to be a hot ticket item, implying that people are going to think they're going to be able to make a lot of money from doing short-term rentals. I'm not sure that that assumption necessarily is true.
Okay, I didn't want to cut you off, and I don't want to respond to that because that's in the nature of the debate that we'll have at a future time.
Yep.
Third question. You had said in there, and really, actually, it goes right back to the question I just asked. Somewhere in your written proposal, you had referred to maybe the extra 10, the 40 permits would be for that would accommodate some people who have plans to run short-term rentals in the short term. I think that's how you termed it. I guess you've given me the best answer you can at this time. You would increase the number of permits to make sure everyone who wants one initially gets one.
I would.
So I guess that raises a new question. If everybody who wants one gets one, and you're not going to have limits on the number of days per month or weekends per month that somebody can rent, how is that responding to all the other goals we had put in the goal statement? I mean, why isn't that just opening up the floodgates?
Yep. No, I understand what you're asking. I understand what you're saying. My assumption is, I think the people who are I don't think that's going to open up the floodgates. I don't think there are that many people in Noank who are going to say, gee, what a great idea. Let's go do short-term rentals. So it's a risk that you take. And I agree, it's a risk.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Nice job, thank you. And 5 minutes under budget, isn't that nice? I'm sorry, under schedule. Lynn, are you prepared to be next?
I am.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to start out with kind of why we're doing this. You know, we all know that Noank's a special place, not just its ideal location on a peninsula and its beautiful old architecture, but its people, its history, its culture, and its community. Noank has its own governance for fire, parks, cemetery, water, trash, zoning, and so on, and it has its own institutions, such as the Noank Baptist Church, where many events for the entire community take place, the Historical Society, which has a museum holding donated treasures, and it puts on programs for the community. Youth can learn to sail at the Ram Island Yacht Club and can learn to scull well enough to earn college scholarships through the Noank Rowing Club. You know, and the list of these organizations goes on and on. These organizations require a lot of members and volunteers. Now, of course, not everyone who moves here will be interested in these organizations, but if the population of Noank residents shrinks, the pool of potential volunteers will be decimated, and the organizations ultimately will shrivel and die and change our community. And Noank also has close-knit neighborhoods, people who go to great lengths to help each other, or to come together for parades, parties, or luminaria. Neighborhoods require neighbors, people who live here, as their full-time residents or their primary residence, or as their second home where they come often. What we must be very careful to do as members of the Zoning Commission is to ensure that any new zoning regulations do not contribute to the hollowing out of the community. For short-term rentals, the easiest thing for the commission to do is just to say they're not allowed. That could change our community in a bad way. However, we know that some folks cannot afford to pay all their taxes without some help from renting out their properties. How do we as a commission achieve the right balance to allow people to be able to stay in their homes while at the same time not hollowing out the community by having fewer houses with neighbors in them? And getting that balance right is the trick. So I have a proposal for one way to do it. Now, our Noank Zoning Commission has decided upon goals for the short-term rental regulations. And these goals, which I think are excellent goals, they were developed specifically for Noank. And so now we have each of the 7 commissioners on the Noank Zoning Commission, the 5 regular members and the 2 alternates, outlined a set of regulations that in their mind met the goals, which gives us rich material from which to pull and talk about and to understand. For my proposal, there are 3 types of rental units that I will discuss. First is bedrooms in someone's house. Second is apartments. And third is whole house rentals where the owner is not on the premises. Starting with bedroom rentals in someone's house. That's already in the regulations under rooming houses. That section of the regulations is old and needs to be updated. I'm suggesting that we update and move room rentals into our new short-term rental regulations. I'm proposing that the house in which the bedrooms are rented must be the principal residence of the property owner. That the owner or a designated host must be there in the house at the time of the rental. The rental is for 1 or 2 bedrooms with 1 or 2 associated bathrooms that can either be private bathrooms or shared. The rental must be to a single party of people. It can't be to 2 separate groups of people, 1 in each bedroom. No kitchen facilities or food can be provided. The reason for that is if food is provided, it becomes a bed and breakfast, and that falls under a different set of regulations. I think those are regulations by the state. And if it has kitchen facilities, it becomes an apartment, which is a different category. So in my plan, there's no limit on the number of days for room rentals. This is like having guests in your home, except that they are paying guests. For apartments, in my plan, apartments are not allowed to be turned into short-term rentals. In many other communities, they started out allowing apartments to be rented as short-term rentals. Property owners quickly realized that they could make a lot more money with short-term rentals than with long-term rentals. And then in a very short amount of time, even like a couple years, like for Boulder, there was a shortage of long-term rentals in the community. In Noank, we already have a shortage of long-term rental apartments. So in my plan, converting them to short-term rental units is not allowed. Now, we've talked at great length about the legacy homeowners, but we also have renters who are 2nd and 3rd generation Noankers. Our renters include store managers who open up their stores even after hurricanes and blizzards, elder care providers, young couples and young families with children, single professionals, and retirees. If we don't get our regulations right, we could drive them right out of town. So no apartments as short-term rentals. For whole house rentals, if we allow an unrestricted amount of whole house rental activity, I think we all appreciate that Noank could quickly turn into a summer community of short-term rental houses. Now, there are 3 basic ways to limit the activity so that this doesn't happen. One way is to allow a lot of houses to do it, but to severely limit how much activity can occur at each house, number of days per year, and so on. And Dana nicely showed this with his slides. and most of the other commissioners are using that kind of limit, and it gives every homeowner a shot at having a short-term rental. It is administratively the most complex. It will require the most extra staff time and the most ongoing surveillance. Now, many communities use other types of limits, namely either to A, restrict the number of short-term rental permits given, and Dana described one way to do that. And to your answer, Larry, yes, this is done in other communities, and I don't think there have been legal challenges, and I think it would stand up to them. And secondly, they require that for any house to get a short-term rental permit, it must be, this is a separate option, require that for any house to get a short-term rental permit, it must be the principal residence of the owner. So I put both of those options into my plan as choices, as track A or track B. So you can choose track A, which limits the number of houses allowed to have a whole house short-term rental permit, or you can choose track B, which requires that the house be the principal residence of the owner. Let's first look at track A in my plan, restricting the number of permits for whole house rentals. So I'm limiting it to 5% for village residential, village commercial, and waterfront commercial as one group, and 5% for the R12, R20, and R40, that is all the residential districts outside of the village. The permits will only be given to a person or the beneficiary of a trust. No corporate ownerships are allowed. Each family can only have one permit. Licenses, as with Dana's, licenses will be granted in order of application. Everyone who doesn't get a permit is placed on a waiting list. If the short-term renter operator loses a license for bad behavior, they go to the back of the line on the waiting list. And other communities have reported that this is a big motivator for good behavior. Because the number of licenses is limited, as what Dana was saying, there can be more rental activity at each property. They can rent a lot. However, and I actually agree with your point, Rick, that you were making about maybe jumping ahead to questions, but there can be an issue with churn, and that is especially true for I think families with children, that they don't want a lot of different people coming in all the time whom they don't know, and they're concerned about their children. But in this plan, where they still can rent a lot, our proposals were supposed to meet all of the goals established, when one of those was to prevent the frequent turnover. We don't want houses functioning like hotels. And so for that reason, I said limit the rentals to no more than one rental per week and require 1 day between rentals. And rules like that do add to the administrative burden, but they do help contain the turnover. So that option could essentially allow everyone who is currently operating a short-term rental to continue doing so. But if using this option, it is important to have a requirement that the permit actually be used, that short-term rentals actually do occur on the property, because people who are supposed to have short-term rentals can try to buy up the permits and then not use them. That has been done. And that's not fair to people who are waiting for permits. So in Durango, Colorado, they require rental activity every quarter. For Noank, I extended that time period to rental activity required every 6 months. I'm not sure what the best time period would be to use, but I just know that some level of rental activity, ongoing rental activity, needs to be required. Well, what happens to someone whose financial circumstances change and they need a short-term rental permit to stay in their house? They want to do a whole house rental, but they're placed on a waiting list. That was a point I think Beth has made before. Well, meanwhile, this individual can rent bedrooms to help ends meet. It's not as lucrative as a whole house rental, but it's a doable stopgap measure while waiting for a whole house rental permit. In Durango, Colorado, this worked well, so that there was not friction among people who wanted the whole house rental permits, but they couldn't get them right away. Now for the alternative approach to whole house rentals, which would be track B, which track B requires that the house be the primary residence of the short-term rental operator. This means that the owner lives in the house. I specify for 9.5 months of the year, which means that the house can be rented for no more than a total of around 10 weeks per year. The idea here is that this is helping people stay in their homes, the place where they actually live, their primary residence. This requirement helps to discourage the commercial investor or the person who wants to use short-term rentals to help afford their vacation home that they plan to flip in a few years. It does not help the legacy owners for whom the family home is now a second home. This approach is used, for example, in Boulder, Colorado, Portland, Oregon, San Francisco, California, and Boston, Massachusetts. And all of these places are very pricey and people need help staying in their homes. Now, in the write-up of my proposal, I've compared and contrasted track A and track B in more depth. I've discussed the advantages and disadvantages of these two approaches of whole house rentals. I've also discussed in that document how my plan with either the track A or the track B option meets each of the 7 goals developed by the Noank Zoning Commission, which was our assignment. I'll wrap it up by briefly discussing the nuisance aspect of short-term rentals. I very much like Blake's statement where he says, no objectionable traffic congestion, noise, smoke, odor, or other unsuitable conditions any time of day or night. And because noise is the area where we expect the most difficulty, I think we should add a few more statements relative to noise. Events and parties are not allowed. You know, that statement is standard boilerplate for short-term rental contracts. And I've changed a little bit since I wrote this, but I think now there's no need, and I would not say that no guests are allowed. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that you can't have anybody over for dinner. And if there are questions about what is and isn't allowed under that, that's best handled between the short-term renter and the short-term owner-operator. Quiet hours are between 9 p.m. and 8 a.m. And quiet hours is a term that's generally understood. It means very quiet at those times. And those are the times when people particularly are trying to sleep. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Questions of Lynn? Larry?
Couple of clarifications on track A. You're down to the limited number of permits, but I could rent, that's for whole house. I could rent a bedroom as an STR. Or are there any restrictions on renting bedrooms for an STR for a homeowner?
Yeah, I think someone would have, that would have to be decided. I think they would have one type of license or the other. And there is no restriction on, other than it can be no more than 2 bedrooms. So they could rent out 1 bedroom to a group, or they could rent out 2 bedrooms to a group. But there would be no restriction on how often they could do that. As I said, that's the idea, is that that's just like having guests come to your home, and someone's always there. And I don't think that creates an issue.
All right, so you require a permit, but there's no limitations if you're only renting 1 or 2 bedrooms under your proposal. Under track B, you talked about it requires the residency of the owner during the short-term rental.
No.
What restrictions?
No, it's not the resident. No. It has to be their home. They have to be they have to be a resident 9.5 months of the year. It's a whole house rental. So when the house is rented, they're out of there.
Ah, okay.
Sorry, I didn't make that clear.
Whole house rental.
Yeah.
And were there any limits in the amount of days, number of rentals, et cetera, under that assumption?
No, I think for the turnover, you would put in a rule as you did for the track A, where it's something like no more than once per week and a day in between rentals, something like that. Also, what happens in the unlikely event that those would exceed 5% or 10% or 15%? If there became a lot of those, then I think that there would need to be additional restrictions in terms of the amount of rental activity allowed. The numbers that I put in the written report, I just pulled out of thin air basically, but that if people are taking it seriously, that would need to be thought out more carefully.
Thanks.
Other questions? Dana, Beth, Blake, Nip? Dana?
Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Lynn, the difference between a bedroom and an apartment is whether there's a kitchen or not. Is that right?
Well, apartments do have kitchens. And under the bedroom rental, there can't be food. So yes, I think that's probably correct.
Okay. And how would you, you're not allowing apartments, so how would you enforce, I mean, there are at least several people who are renting their apartments as Airbnbs or HomeAways. How would you enforce that if they're not part of the program?
Well, I think no matter which of the plans we go through, you've got to have a monitoring company looking for illegal activity. And you have to require that everyone who is advertising on a website put their permit number on it.
Okay, thanks.
Blake, Beth, Nip. Nip?
Lynn, I really liked your preamble, and I hope we end up with something that adheres to that. I did have a question. In your preamble, you talked about the need to balance the preservation of the residential character of the village with, financial needs of some of the property owners. How sympathetic are you toward what are virtually absentee owners who are here maybe a few weeks a year, but they want to be able to rent their property probably more time than they actually occupy it in order to help carry it? How does that help to maintain the residential character of the community?
Yes, Nip, thank you for your comments on the introduction. And I know, Nip, that you care greatly about community. That's obvious. Yeah, I think that people that I do have a concern about people who are buying the houses. And that's what I call almost, they become vacation homes because they're hardly ever here. And I think if we're not careful in whatever regulations that we have, that we can have even more people, we can make it possible for more people and make it affordable for more people to buy these houses as vacation homes, because then they can rent it out at other times of year. So Track B requires a principal residence, so that takes care of that. Track A does not take care of that. And what you're doing by having a limited number of licenses, you just are minimizing the amount of that activity, but it is a possibility.
Thank you.
Blake or Beth? Okay, couple from me. Lynn, how do you prove the 285 days a year, which is about 9 months?
Well, I talked to San Francisco Planning and Zoning about that to ask them that question, because I thought that's awfully difficult to do. And so what they do, first of all, they look at the site where the short-term rental is advertised, and they look and they see how it's advertised. And if the owner's saying, "Oh, we're in Italy 7 months of the year," it's like, that's an oops. And if often in the reviews they give information that indicates that they're really not there that often. And with monitoring companies, then you can see if that place is rented out for more days, that goes over the amount of time, and it goes more than their free rental days. It's going into the time that they're living there. Then you know there's a problem. That's how they do it.
Okay. Hearing that, does it concern you that that kind of review activity is very labor intensive? Even if it's an internet-based application, it's still intensive in terms of the effort to look at each suspect operation to answer that one question. And a corollary question to that, related to it actually, is I can't help but notice that I think every example you used is a large city with a planning staff. Does it trouble you that the kinds of things we would have to do in your to implement your plan would be very labor intensive, and the examples you're using are from big cities with big staffs?
When I have talked to host compliance and I ask them to give me examples of communities who are doing short-term rentals, who have part-time staff, I have not gotten any examples of that. That most places who are planning for zoning departments, most of them do have full-time staffs. So when I've talked to communities who, and most of them are, they're larger places. So when I've talked to places, when I've come up with estimates, when I've thought of how much activity, what we might need, I've tried to scale it back by the size of, like, the number of houses we have in our community and the number of houses they have. But I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that if we want to monitor and enforce this activity, that we can do it with our present staff. That is not possible under any of these plans.
Okay. So you answered apartments. And under your plan, the non-hosted properties could be rented unlimited, right? If the permits were limited. Did you answer that? Similar to Dana's? Is that correct?
Yes, with some caveats for frequent turnover, yes.
I don't have to ask that one then, because I think the answer would be the same.
Yeah. So that would be much as they are doing now, but there's a limited number of them.
Yeah, the unlimited rentals, which raises that.
And I think, I think that with the well-done short-term rentals, that is not a huge problem. I mean, for any short-term rentals, there is the possibility that if a seller is trying to sell their house and the buyer finds out that there's a short-term rental next door, no matter what the amount of activity is, that buyer may not be interested in that house. And I think especially if they have children, it may take longer to sell and for less money. That is a possibility. But I think that's true for all of them.
Yeah, yeah. Same question I asked Dana. If the permit holder can short-term rent on an unlimited basis, how do you feel, or how do you reconcile the fact that the neighbors lose a quality of life? for the very reason you just pointed out, except you did it in the context of the sale of the property. I'm more concerned about
Right.
the number. And
Right. Yeah. So one thing I think is really, really important in any of these regulations is that we've got to have enforcement that is quick and effective. So if we have someone that's decided they're going to have a party house and they're doing it every weekend, we have to have the mechanism in place that within a 2-month period of time, counting the public hearing with a 30-day notice, we can stop that activity and remove that license. I mean, we have to be serious about this.
Mhm.
So I think that's an important component of allowing this at all. And, you know, I think that, so I think that you're really trying to control the activity in that way so that it's not objectionable. That being said, in the most recent rentals that I've heard, and this is just personal observation, it's not an in-depth, you know, knowledge, but the only complaints I've heard about were a family with children talking about frequent people coming in that they, you know, that they didn't know, and they're concerned there. So, but that's, you know, that's good. I think that would be a problem with many, as I said, with many of these proposals.
Okay. Maybe the last one here, I'm not sure, because I had 2 pages of notes. In section C1, which is your limited numbers of permits, this goes back to your document. You said the permits will be issued in the order in which a completed permit is received, with a waiting list for those above the allowable limits. So I'm thinking first there's a race for people to figure out everything they need to do to fill out an application and get it in before the next guy. And if it gets rejected because of some minor point, but it's rejected, and they maybe go back behind a list of a whole bunch of people who, you know, didn't have the same error, or they're in line. I wonder if you've thought about what appears to me a kind of a gold rush mentality, and then a waiting list of people who maybe were doing renting but weren't so artful in doing their application, and they're stuck on a waiting list for a couple of years, even though they were actually involved in the activity. Not that they deserve any rights because they were doing it prior, but they're going to feel that they deserve rights. So I want to know if you considered that.
You know, I had not, but I have an answer for that. And I think it's really important, Rick. I like your thinking. I think it's really important to think how this could backfire and, you know, unintended consequences. I think that would be minimized, because everything that the commission has done so far is to have, to not have a lot of requirements. For example, we're not requiring people to submit a copy of their home insurance to say that they have insurance that covers short-term rentals. There would be some kind of attestation statement that we would have them check the boxes and sign. And so host compliance sets, there are companies like that, set that kind of thing up so that people can apply online. And they said that most people can apply online with no problem. Less than 10% of the people cannot. But I think during that process, I think that we have to figure some extra staff time, clerk time, to be there in the office, to meet with them, to help them, so that if they have trouble with computer application, that they can get theirs through speedily, to try to prevent that from happening, to give people all the assistance that we can. And I think that has to be ongoing to help people.
Under 3D, Yeah. No more than one rental initiated each week and a day between each rentals. This is your section where, when you were marrying the measures to the goals.
Right.
But that's where it occurred to me that I wondered if you had thought about, well, it's the same word I used for Dana, and you answered it earlier, the churn. That's a rental or two a week, 3 days, a day off, 3 days, all through the summer, under the limited permit.
Well, no, it couldn't be more than 1 day, because I also said it couldn't be more than one initiated a week.
Oh, initiated, okay.
Yeah,
So
no more than one initiated a week.
between rentals.
Which I
Okay.
think- Yeah, and
Um,
a day between.
Okay.
So it addresses it to some extent.
Okay, that's a little better. It's still a rental.
I hear you.
Yeah. I use that in the debate. Okay, I guess my final one is under number 3 of D1. This is the principal resident.
Right.
I read that paragraph and I wondered if you had thought through the implications of implementation of something like that, where for a given period of time you have to count permits, and then if they're between 5 and 10% or 10 and 15%, you end up having to send a notice out to everyone saying, okay, your new opportunities are these, but they may change the next quarter or the next month.
Yeah, I think you'd have to give people a year or two to adjust, a year or two notice. I don't think that would be fair to them to have to just suddenly change. That would not be right.
Okay, I didn't read it that way when I read it.
Well, I didn't write that.
Oh.
But in answer to your question,
All right.
that would only be reasonable. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that does it for me. Anybody else have a question? Okay, thank you. Give me a minute to collect my thoughts, because now I have to go. Okay. Larry, could you put that thing up? Let me give a preamble first. I hope everyone has read the plan, because I'm not going to talk about every aspect of it. I'm going to talk about the high points. You'll note, if you've looked through the reg book, I've modeled it after the home occupancy section of the current regs, so it has as complete a package as I could think of everything we'd want to deal with, but I don't want to talk about all of those. I'm going to hit the high points. Now, Larry's going to put up a matrix here in a minute. I didn't do the screen sharing of it, so he'll have to scroll when I ask him to. My premise, though, is to make people as happy as possible and enact a simple ordinance while meeting the obligations of Noank's overall zoning ordinance. When all is said and done, I think I'd like to see Noank get back to as close to normal as possible, but if we get sued, I want to prevail. And I think we enhance our chances of that if we've made a good faith effort to accommodate the desires of the people who may be ultimately dissatisfied. So Larry, now can you put that up, that color matrix? Good, thank you. Okay, definitions. My view of owner of hosted means the owner or the agent must be present on site during the rental or next door. And I define next door as your next door neighbors, anybody who shares a backyard boundary, or somebody across the street. The responsible party, if the owner isn't there, is immediately proximal to the rented property. Non-hosted means none of that is true, and the owner's agent's going to have to respond within 20 or 30 minutes and resolve the problem. So that's the distinction, hosted versus non-hosted. On the moratorium, I would say that short-term rentals are prohibited on non-hosted rental properties for 3 years after the date of purchase, and this would start on the date of enactment. I don't know of a regulation where you can backdate the impact of it and say, well, he bought his house 2 years ago, so he only has to wait 1 more year. Or more likely, he bought his house 2 years ago, therefore the regulation doesn't apply to him. In other words, there's no 3-year moratorium because he bought the house not in anticipation of the regulation. On the other hand, I would, for hosted rental properties where the owner or the agent is immediately present, I would not impose the moratorium. So that's a distinction we may want to debate later on. You may want to ask questions about it. For rental periods, I would give everyone one, this one, buckle up, because I'm sure this is going to generate some interest. Well, interest is the wrong word. Attention. I would give everyone one bite of the apple. At the public hearing last June, some people claimed they have operated or can operate without causing problems. So I say, let's take them up on the claim. Let them operate as they wish, no rental limits until the first verified complaint. The verified complaint would be, we get the complaint that comes in, Bill does a minimal review of it, we schedule a public hearing, we listen to the complainant, then we listen to the owner, we make a judgment call. That's part of what we're required to do as elected commissioners. If the complaint is verified, my view is they lose their permit for a year, and when the permit is restored, they have to live by the limits on the number of rentals. Either 1 rental a month, which is my preference, or 1 rental for a 2-week period, which is the other one the commission talked about in the last couple of meetings. I'm happy with whatever limits the commission agrees on. I know this is a provocative idea, but if they can prove they can maintain good order, perhaps we should give them a chance to prove it. I think we're going to need some buy-in for acceptance, and we also need to give ourselves a reality check because people are doing these rentals now. For hosted rentals, I would not bother regulating the number of rentals per month for hosted rentals. And that's similar to, I think, something Lynn said. My reason is the responsible party is present. That ensures that the unruly behavior or the parking congestion is minimized. And frankly, if they abuse the privilege, we have a hearing, we pull their permit. So it's not irrevocable. If the house is occupied, then that dark house syndrome that we've talked about is not a concern. So I would issue a permit revocable for cause and require the unruly behavior and the parking limits apply, but don't limit the number of rentals. And a way of looking at this, this is a quintessential owner trying to keep the home in the face of perhaps a spouse who passed away or falling on financial, more difficult times. This is the one where we have leaned in towards, let's try and make this happen. The other thing that could be of interest or concern is this whole concept. It's defined under number of permits per person, about halfway down the page. This is the issue of more than 1 house owned. Generally, I agree that it should be 1 permit per ownership entity. And I'm not sure how you even enforce that. Somebody used the example of, the husband owns 1 house or has 1 permit, the wife has another, the son has another. That's a real possibility. So we'd have to cogitate on enforcement and monitoring, but I'm okay generally with saying 1 permit for ownership per ownership entity. But I want to know what we do about the people who may own more than 1 house and they do short-term rentals with them. If multiple houses are owned and they were used for short-term rentals prior to the date of enactment, I would say that ownership entity can have that number of permits. They can't get more permits if they buy more houses. And particularly if we make permits non-transferable, and I hope we do, except to family descendants, father to or parent to child, very literally descendants in the family line. Eventually 1 permit per ownership entity should be the result. For parking, I would say it has to be off street with, and just kind of a reality check. There are going to be some places in Noank in the village where the person doesn't have a driveway, they don't have a backyard, they've always parked on the street, and they have a couple of spots that they routinely park on the street. And I don't know how we tell them, they can't use the same parking spots that they've used for years. My proposal would be you have the ZEO determine it. He goes out and investigates. If he says, yeah, that's basically right, I talked to neighbors and, they've been using a couple of spots. So I would not make it any more than 2 parking spots. But if the ZEO determines that this has been the established practice for that property, I would allow the renter of that owner to have the same parking opportunity. The other exception is very similar. If the parking is a nonconformity, let's just envision a house that has no backyard and no driveway, and street parking isn't even possible, but they've worked out a way over the years. They either pay somebody to park nearby or somehow they work it out where they have been able to park and use their house. Now they want to rent it when they're not there. I would say extend them the same opportunity. The same nonconformity for the owner applies to the renter. I'm going to love the debate on these at some future meeting because I know this is.
I lost you.
Okay, you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, at what point did you lose me, Nip?
I think we heard you through the parking. I don't know if you've gone beyond that.
Okay, no, I did not, and I only made the comment that I expect the debate to be lively on these things.
Right.
Yeah.
We need Larry to scroll it.
Pardon me?
We need Larry to scroll it.
No, it's only 1 page. And I only have a few other points to make. On unruly behavior, it's as in the big matrix. The general rule that, don't be disruptive in the neighborhood, but specifically 10 at night to 9 in the morning, no loud conversation, no loud music, no loud noises, fireworks, any of that kind of stuff. Those would be prohibited in that window. For number of bedrooms authorized, I would say we ought to use the property tax card for the town. It tells you how many bedrooms are authorized for the property. And I would say use that number or 4, whichever is less. We'd need a copy of that card from the owner once he puts in his application. Persons over 12 per bedroom, it would be 2 times the number of authorized rooms. And then for parties and events, I would say 2 times that number. So you could have a maximum of 16, including the rental party and the people at the party. If it was a 2-bedroom house, you could have a maximum of 8. And for events, frankly, I go back and forth on this. I understand the logic of not allowing them at all. My view is maybe you prevent them for non-hosted rentals because they're virtually uncontrollable. But maybe you allow them for hosted rentals because the owner or the agent is right there and they can control the excessive behavior. Final 2 points on monitoring and enforcement. I think that cost should be borne by the owners. So whatever you have a permit fee, which is separate, but then whatever the cost of monitoring is, whether it's a few more hours for a staff member or it's a home compliance type internet app, whatever that cost is, you divide it by the number of permit holders, and that's an assessment for their business to operate. It should not be borne by the taxpayers of the fire district. Finally, liability for code compliance. If you recall the hearing last June, we had a series of measures that said they had to prove to us they were in compliance with the building code and with the health code and with the fire code and all of this compliance that we had to prove. So I took all that out of there. And I basically say that all resides with the owner. He's obligated he's responsible to meet those obligations. But I would, on the application, have him sign a statement that says he holds the Noank Fire District harmless against any litigation. Now, people can sue you for whatever they want, but if the owner has signed off on he holds us harmless, I think that's somewhat protective of the fire district and the people. Casey could maybe say differently, but I would wait to hear him say that. So I just went a minute over time, and I'd be happy to answer questions. Thanks. And Larry, maybe we can just put everybody right over that. Okay.
Want me to stop sharing?
Does anybody need that to be on the screen anymore or no? I
Not
don't-
me.
Okay, take it off then, Larry, please. Thank you. Okay. Now, questions? Yeah.
I just had a question about the rental periods. You said everybody gets one bite of the apple. No rental limits whatsoever until the first complaint?
Yeah.
Okay.
Provocative, isn't it? Yeah, my view would be, you've said to us you can do this without aggravating the neighborhood. You have one bite of the apple. Once we get a complaint and we schedule it for hearing and we decide that it's a valid complaint, then you lose your permit for a year, and then you have to obey the sharp limits, the one per month or the one rental per 2 weeks. As I say, that the debate will be lively on that one. It's trying to accommodate the interest of the people who came to the hearings and said, we're not the problem.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Others? Lynn, and then Nip.
All right, so I understand the, having the owner be on an adjacent property, because I've rented places like that, and the owner's right next door, and maybe the manager is actually across the street, and that's the person who cleans the house and puts the cookies in the cookie jar, and it's great having them right there. By any questions, they'll come over and raise that window for you or whatever, they're right there. So it's nice from that standpoint. And they definitely, the ones I've experienced have been very interested in maintaining the property. But we do have our goal E, discourage replacement of permanently occupied residences or long-term rental properties by short-term rentals. And we have A, where we're trying to preserve the residential character of Noank and its closely knit neighborhoods. And so we have those houses then that are being turned into, pretty much full-time short-term rental activity. It's a business activity that's taking out, that is eliminating the possibility of a neighbor. So how do you address that?
Yeah. I've gone back and forth on that a number of times. Non-hosted is kind of out of the way on this one. This is for the hosted rentals.
Yes.
How broad do you make the definition of the people who need to be around there to call it a hosted rental? The one flaw which you've identified is you do have a possibility for the dark house syndrome there, because that house is only being used for rentals, even though the responsible party is next door. I can go either way on it. So when we get to the debate, I'll be listening to people's views and I'll be reassessing my own. I was trying to make it as liberal as possible and still control the things we most want to control. And in this particular case, your question, I've heard a few comments or seen a few letters from people. This doesn't help the renters much at all, because they say very few people own two houses next door to each other and they live in one and they rent the other one. So I think functionally what happens with this is 99 times out of 100, it's going to be the owner lives in the house and rents a couple of rooms. In effect, that's the classic definition in my mind of the hosted rental. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I say in the Noank village alone, I know one person who owns 4 houses in a row and somebody else who owns 3 in a row. So
Really?
yeah,
Interesting.
we can talk offline.
Interesting. Huh. Interesting.
So on the grandfathering existing activity, that is just for the people who are already doing it prior to the enactment of the zoning regulations? Or are you saying it's for everybody when they first get started?
As many of these things as possible, I would prefer not to have it apply just to people who are doing the activity, quote, illegally. Because remember, the advice we've gotten,
Right.
they're not legal now.
Right.
So I makes my skin crawl a little bit to suggest it the way I suggested it. I would prefer it apply to everybody equally, which means whether you did it in the past or you decide to do it tomorrow, if you're going to do rentals, you get the permit, you have to obey noise, you have to obey parking. Your permit can be pulled if you misbehave or your renters misbehave, but you can rent as many times as you want until we verify a complaint, and then you go to the limits. And that would be for everybody. I think that's how the matrix was worded, to be honest.
Okay. Okay.
I don't think it said, that was one of the clarifications I made, that
Yeah, that's what I was trying to. I was
without
just,
limit until first verified complaint. Yeah, it didn't say anything about, I think an earlier draft a month or two ago, maybe in the original document,
okay.
it said that, but I would like that to apply to everybody equally. Which of course will raise a debatable point for the future, that it expands the number of people who can rent with no limits.
Yeah.
Um,
It expands it a lot. Yeah.
uh,
Then you, for the hosted, let's just start with hosted. So you're saying that that is, you can initiate, you can initiate a rental once in a 2-week period. Is it?
Yeah, that, actually, no. What I really mean by that is you can have one rental per month, or you can have one rental per 2-week period, but you can't have two in the 2-week period. It can be a 2-week long rental, or a rental per month can be 30 days in length, or it could be a week, or it could be a weekend. But you don't get to have two different rentals in that whatever time period you pick.
So that means if the rental extends a day into another 2-week period, then they're out for that. So it's not just initiation, it's the number of days you are actually renting it.
Yeah,
Is that what it means?
my view, and maybe in debate I'll change it, but my view is one rental event per time period. If you pick a month, you spill over 2 days into the next month because it's a middle of the week or the weekend or whatever. However you define that period, it's one rental for that period. And if it goes 3 days over into the next one, I guess arguably that's a rental in the next period.
That's the next period.
The owner would have to be pretty artful with the calendar to make sure they maximize their earnings.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. And then, so in that 2-week period, is that fixed on the calendar, or is that rolling depending on when that?
I think I had Monday noon. I forget now. I thought it
No,
was.
I got that you had noon Monday to two, for the 2-week one. Monday
Just
for
so
the
there wouldn't be a
following
break in
2
the
weeks.
weekend and have, theoretically have two different rental periods butting up on a weekend.
But if I rented on a Thursday, it's going to go back to that previous Monday because it's in that week. And it will extend 2 more Mondays.
For 2 weeks.
Right.
Yeah, for the 2-week rental, it could cover, no, it'd be one weekend after the first Monday, one weekend after the second Monday, and the rental period ends on that, effectively the third Monday, right?
Okay, so what you do before that next Monday is free, and then it's the next 2 Mondays that are the limits?
Can we sort this out later?
Yes, okay. Yeah, so okay, let me just, so the comment, I think it perhaps could use some more thought about how whether it would actually be a fixed calendar or a rolling calendar, and how the person who's trying to do it and we trying to monitor it, how you go forward, and you also have to be able to go back in time to not overlap. So I think it can get pretty complex. Moving on, thank you, Nip. On the number of bedrooms that can be rented in a house, so you have a max of 4 bedrooms. And I think that our zoning regulations should all be enforceable. So, you know, like who's going to monitor where people are sleeping? So, and this is about how can we enforce this? So if we have a 5-bedroom house, 5 people rent it, and each is intending to have their own bedroom, but our regulations don't allow it, but there's no way for us to monitor and enforce it. So should we have regulations like that that would be really hard to monitor?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Let me see. Property card says you have 3-bedroom house, like mine.
It says 5.
No, let's say mine, well, you're saying what happens if it says 5? It's 4, because it's 5 not to exceed 4, so it's 4 or less. You have an 8-bedroom house. I'm trying to avoid having a huge group come in to a house of any number of bedrooms, because I would think that'd be disruptive to a neighbor.
But you say that that's what you would say, you would allow them to, you would allow that, and that's what you would say in your advertisement, but it's obviously not true about the property. If you're renting a whole house,
They're
the house has more bedrooms.
renting a whole house, but you can't have any more than 2 people per bedroom up to a maximum of 4 bedrooms.
Oh, so you're just using it to calculate how many people are allowed, not where they sleep.
Well, they can sleep anywhere they want, but the
Yeah,
fact
it's
is they
the
can't
number
have
of
more
people
people
allowed.
than the number of bedrooms.
Okay,
They have
got
to
it,
have 4. Okay.
got it. All right, then on the quiet hours, like what time do you figure young school children go to bed at night?
Honestly, I haven't analyzed that. Whatever time of day the commission thinks is a good time of day is fine, but
All
I
right,
want it to be when most people normally sleep. I mean, you can complicate these by saying, well, Friday and Saturday should be later because people party later on Friday and Saturday. Well, that may be true, but do their neighbors who maybe work at 6 o'clock in the morning because they live there year round? I mean, that's how you complicate these things. I would just pick whatever the commission thinks is an appropriate time of day restriction for the really unusually noisy circumstances and say it applies to everybody.
all right. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Nip?
Yeah, I've had occasion to spend a fair amount of time over at Groton Long Point over the last month. One of our kids and their family and their kids are going to be renting there from September through the middle of June. And in my time over there and looking at rentals and just spending time there, and I also bike over there reasonably often, it's a totally different community from Noank. I know from my time working with the Noank Community Market that the residents, the occupancy in Groton Long Point drops by about 65% in the winter because people own their places there primarily as summer places, and they go to their primary residences or they go to Florida or whatever. I'm concerned that with the pretty lax standards that you are suggesting we start with, that we might end up as another Groton Long Point. And so my question is, what is it in your proposed regulations that would prevent us from becoming another Groton Long Point?
Okay, that's a really good question. So the premise is everybody gets a permit and they all can rent as many times as they want, and they really manage things so well that nobody ever complains. Therefore, they're renting as many times as they want. And if that's the premise, that's a weakness of my plan, which gets me back to thinking, well, maybe we're going to have some time limits once a month or whatever. Good point. The other, yeah, and the moratorium really doesn't respond to that. It's really the time limit, the time per month, time per week. That's a good question. Yeah.
Okay, my next question, there's a couple of dimensions to what appears to be a tolerance on your part for whoever's doing it today. And there's no moratoriums applied to them retroactively. But my concern is that everybody who's doing it today is illegal. And therefore, why do we want to have a baseline? And this would apply to Dana as well, I think. Why do we want to have a baseline that says anybody who's doing it today is, we're going to try and accommodate them going forward? Why do we want to have any special accommodation for these people who are violating our existing regulations and diminishing the neighborhood quality of the fire district?
My answer to that is because they are doing it. And if we can accommodate as much as we can of current behavior, we should try and do that. Years ago, somebody described a good regulation to me as something that tries to preserve circumstances the day after implementation as close to what they were the day before. Now, in some cases here, we can't do that because we already see a problem. Noise, for example. We're not going to exempt people from a noise rule because they happen to be doing rental before we enacted a rule. But, on a moratorium on ownership or on time limits, you could argue that maybe you ought to treat everybody the same, even though some of them were doing it before enactment and technically it's illegal. It's two schools of thought. Now, you can tell how my answer in this, when we get in the debate, I'm going to have all sorts of different views as we push and pull and go back and forth. But I thought it was important that we tried to have a plan that's as accommodating as possible to try and preserve the way things are operating now and only solve the problems that are immediate. And to me, the immediate one is the most obvious one is the noise issue, which needs a solution so that bad behavior doesn't upset the tranquility of neighbors. Yep.
Okay, I understand your point of view. I would just suggest there's a different standard, and it would be more similar to the one we applied to Ford's, in that we made him go back to a blank sheet of paper and start over. We did not grandfather anything. We made him apply for a permit as if.
Hold that thought for the debate, will you? Because it's a really useful comment for the debate time.
Thank you.
I hope you'll hold on.
Final question. You and others have referred to the people at the hearing, and yet there is a large number of people who live in the village who showed up at the annual meeting a year ago and elected Dana, and who also showed up at the annual meeting this year to protect Beth. And they are not the people that we heard from most loudly at the public hearing, the last public hearing. I would like to know the extent to which you recognize that those people exist when you think about what we should do going forward, because I am quite confident if what we draft does not measure up to what they would like to see, we are going to hear from them at the next hearing.
I agree with you entirely. The trend, the way these things operate, from coming from a long history in regulatory matters, you hear a lot from the people who are making money. They're very vocal. They make sure that you know if they're dissatisfied with something, and there's probably 10 times that number that are out there who don't speak that much. They may even come to a meeting and stay in the back and listen. They're not going to argue with their neighbors, and they don't have the same financial incentive, but their views matter too. And if I was Lazar here and I was coming out with a pronouncement that this is what we're going to do, my plan would look totally different in many respects. But I think it's fair to hear all sides and to have the debate come after we hear 7 plans or however many people present. And I'll be happy to debate the views. But I agree with your question. The silent majority is probably undoubtedly larger than the number of people who are doing the renting. And we need to keep in the back of our mind that they have their rights too. Frankly, my view in a lot of these things is I go back to the first page of the Noank ordinance, the blue book, and I read that purpose statement. Nowhere in there does it say one of our purposes is to provide for the financial opportunities of people with single family residences to rent and make money. But it says a lot about the general welfare and the tranquility and the people. I'm debating anyway. That's my answer to your question. It's a good question, and it's going to be a fair debatable point.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Okay, other questions of other proposers, if not me, since we have a few minutes and you may have come up with a question for Lynn or Dana that you hadn't thought about earlier. Seeing none, that's what we set out to do tonight, and I don't see any other order of business. Is there a motion to adjourn? Before we do that, next meeting will be a regular meeting. I don't yet know how full the agenda will be with normal business. My intent would be to continue with this process, excuse me, under other business after we get done with normal business. We're going to have a public hearing on the solar panels. I don't expect that to take an awful lot of time. It hasn't seemed to be a contentious issue. I don't know what other applications we may have. So it's conceivable we could be done in a half hour, 40 minutes, and then use the remaining amount of the 2-hour period to do more presentations. So who would like to be next up on presentations, or choose not to, which is your choice also?
Yeah, I'll go.
Okay. Larry next.
No,
Beth.
August 18th, just to be sure. That's our next regular meeting.
August
Okay.
18th, yes. For presentations, Blake or Beth, we might get 2 in. If they're short, maybe we get 3. I don't know. So do you want to just be prepared to say what you'd like to say about your plan?
I'll go at any time,
Okay.
and it shouldn't take too long.
Okay. Same view, Beth? You said that last time. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's plan on, and Nip.
Same.
Pardon me?
Same.
Same. Okay. So all 4 of you will be prepared to speak on the 18th, and we'll see who we can flip whatever we flip on a video screen. Okay. Any other orders of business before I call for a motion to adjourn? Seeing none. Thank you all very much. Well, let's have a motion to adjourn. Yep. Second? Beth? Okay. Motion made and seconded. All those in favor say aye. Okay. Thank you all very much, and particularly Dana and Lynn, because I know you worked a lot on these. I appreciate it. Did I see a hand? Somebody? Oh, just waving by. Okay.